Darius Holt's breath hitched as the cryosleep chamber began to hum. A sharp hiss of escaping gas filled the pod, and his eyes fluttered open, struggling against the disorienting pull of consciousness. His body felt foreign, heavy, his muscles stiff from decades of inactivity. The fog in his mind cleared in jagged fragments, memories flashing before him. War, the cries of his comrades, the fall of their defenses. Then nothing. He hadn't expected to wake up. Not like this. The pod's malfunctioning controls flickered with a sputtering energy, barely holding on to life, much like the man inside it. Darius lurched forward, his legs unsteady as his feet touched the cold ground. For a moment he stood there, swaying, his senses reeling from the sudden exposure to reality. The air was thick with dust, and something metallic lingered in the back of his throat. As his vision steadied, Darius scanned the room, an abandoned cryo bay that once housed hundreds of his brothers in arms. The other chambers were silent, lifeless. Some remained sealed, frost coating their outer layers, but many were shattered, breached by something violent. Darius's stomach twisted. Steeling himself, he took a shaky step forward. His boots crunched over broken glass and twisted metal as he moved toward the exit. The door, half ripped from its hinges, hung askew. He forced it open with a grunt, the rusted metal groaning in protest. Beyond the door, devastation awaited. Darius staggered into the ruins of what had once been the heart of a human outpost. Now, it was little more than a graveyard. Towering structures that once stood proudly now lay in heaps of rubble, their skeletal remains jutting toward the sky like the bones of some long-dead giant. Smoke curled from the wreckage, mingling with the scent of scorched earth and charred flesh. His battalion was gone. Bodies were strewn across the ground, their armor twisted and torn apart by some unseen force. The air was thick with death, and for a brief moment, Darius could hardly breathe. His pulse quickened, panic creeping in, but he forced himself to remain steady. He'd seen death before, too much of it, but never like this. This wasn't a clean execution of battle. This was slaughter. He knelt beside the mangled remains of one soldier, barely recognizing the insignia of his unit through the charred uniform. His fingers traced the shredded armor, feeling the deep gouges left by whatever monstrous force had done this. Darius's hands clenched into fists. He couldn't remember what had happened. Not entirely. The decision to enter cryosleep had been a desperate one, a last-ditch effort to preserve their elite unit when all hope seemed lost. But why had no one woken him? Where had it all gone so horribly wrong? A low rumble echoed through the air, vibrating through the ground beneath his feet. Darius stood quickly, his senses flaring to life. Something was approaching. In the distance, over the horizon of rubble, a colossal shadow moved. Darius froze, his breath catching in his throat as he caught sight of it. A war machine. It towered over the broken landscape, its thick, armored hull gleaming under the fading light. Massive legs stomped across the ground, leaving deep craters in their wake. Plasma cannons jutted from its sides, glowing with deadly energy, and its eyes, cold, mechanical orbs, scanned the desolation. Darius's mouth went dry. This was no ordinary machine. It was a behemoth, built for one purpose: extermination. And now it was hunting. His instincts took over. He dove behind a collapsed wall, his heart pounding in his chest. The war machine's footsteps grew louder, closer. Darius could feel the tremors through the ground, each step shaking the earth beneath him. He pressed his back against the cold stone, breathing shallowly as he tried to assess his situation. He was unarmed, vulnerable, and alone. The machine moved with deliberate precision, scanning the area with its high-pitched whine of servos. Darius peeked out from behind his cover, watching as it swept its massive head from side to side, its scanners searching for any signs of life. His mind raced. He couldn't face that thing, not directly, not without weapons. But he couldn't sit and wait for death either. There had to be a way. He needed time, a plan. But for now, all he could do was stay out of sight. The machine's heavy footfalls slowly receded, fading into the distance. Darius allowed himself to exhale, his body sagging with relief. But he knew it was only temporary. That thing would be back. It wasn't just patrolling, it was hunting. And it wouldn't stop until everything human on this battlefield was dead. Darius stood and surveyed the wreckage once more. His comrades were gone, his unit decimated. But he was still here, still breathing. And as long as he had that, he had a chance. He turned his gaze toward the distant machine, narrowing his eyes. The odds were impossible, the enemy unstoppable. But they had underestimated him, and that would be their fatal mistake. Darius crouched low behind the remains of a fallen building, his breath steady, his mind focused. The war machine, a towering symbol of the alien empire's superiority, still loomed in the distance. Its heavy footfalls had faded for now, but he knew it wouldn't be long before it returned, sweeping the area for any survivors. He had no intention of letting it find him easily. He scanned the environment, his sharp eyes catching every shadow, every ruined structure that could serve as cover. Years of combat on Earth had taught him one unbreakable truth. Humans were survivors, adaptable in ways other species couldn't comprehend. And here, on this war-ravaged planet, those instincts would be the difference between life and death. His mind raced through the possibilities. Direct combat wasn't an option. The machine's plasma cannons and energy shields were far beyond anything he could take on head-to-head. But no machine, no matter how powerful, was invincible. Somewhere, in its towering mass of armor and weaponry, there would be a weakness, a chink in the armor that he could exploit. He needed time to find it, moving with the silence of a predator. Darius slipped from one piece of rubble to another, keeping low and out of sight. Every movement was calculated, deliberate. The alien machine might have superior technology, but Darius had terrain on his side. The ruins of the outpost provided natural cover. Jagged walls, broken towers, and deep craters left by past battles. Each step brought him closer to the machine's path. He kept his eyes on it, watching for patterns, for any hint of predictability in its patrol. Its movements were precise, efficient, but not perfect. The war machine's size made it slower than Darius had initially feared, and its field of vision seemed narrow, likely a flaw in its design, relying too much on raw power and too little on adaptability. He moved again, darting from behind a collapsed pillar to the remnants of a fuel depot. As he reached the cover, the war machine let out a mechanical groan, its massive head turning slowly to sweep the area. Darius froze, pressing himself against the wall, barely daring to breathe. The machine's sensors glowed with a cold, mechanical light, scanning the ruins for any signs of movement. The air hummed with the low whine of its energy fields. For a moment, everything was still. Then, satisfied, the machine turned away, continuing its patrol. Darius exhaled, silently thanking whatever gods might be watching over him. His mind shifted back to the task at hand. If he was going to take down this beast, he needed more than just speed and stealth. He needed a plan. His eyes caught a glint of metal buried in the debris, an old energy cell, likely left behind in the chaos of the outpost destruction. Darius moved swiftly, grabbing it and stuffing it into his vest. Improvised explosives wouldn't bring down the war machine, but they could create a distraction, buying precious time. The war machine's footsteps began to echo again, growing louder. Darius's pulse quickened, but his focus remained sharp. He couldn't afford fear, not now. His battalion was gone, but their fight wasn't over, not as long as he was still breathing. His mind replayed the carnage he'd seen earlier, the slaughtered soldiers, the broken bodies of his comrades. That thing, no, those aliens, had reduced his people to nothing more than corpses. They thought they'd won, but Darius wasn't done. He moved closer, navigating through the ruins like a ghost. Every step was precise, every action deliberate. The war machine sensors flickered in the distance, but Darius was careful to stay out of range, using the terrain to mask his presence. He was learning its patterns, its weaknesses. The machine relied too heavily on its overwhelming firepower. Its designers confident that brute strength alone would guarantee victory. But they hadn't counted on the persistence of a Deathworlder. Darius's eyes narrowed as he spotted a critical flaw. A small, exposed power junction at the base of the machine's rear. It was shielded by a thin layer of armor, but it wasn't invulnerable. If he could get close enough, he might be able to disable the shields entirely. He allowed himself a grim smile. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He would need to get in close. Dangerously close, but if he could disable its shields, the war machine would become vulnerable, even if only for a short window. It was a chance, and right now, it was all he had. The machine let out another mechanical growl, moving further into the ruins. Darius seized the opportunity, darting through the debris toward a low wall that would give him a clearer path to the machine's rear. His muscles burned from the exertion, but he pushed through the fatigue. His every move was a step closer to survival, or death. He reached the wall, peeking over the edge. The machine was close now, towering over the crumbling structures like a giant surveying its prey. Darius's grip tightened around the makeshift explosive he'd crafted with the energy cell. He only had one shot. If this didn't work, he'd be nothing more than another casualty in the rubble. But that wasn't an option. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every soldier who had fallen, for every comrade who had died under the shadow of this alien monstrosity. As the war machine passed, Darius prepared to strike. His mind cleared, his body ready. Darius's breath steadied as the war machine loomed in front of him, oblivious to the lone human stalking it through the ruins. He tightened his grip on the makeshift explosive. Just one shot to disable its shields. Then he'd have to rely on sheer determination and Deathworld instinct to finish the job. He moved swiftly but silently, slipping through the wreckage until he was within striking distance. The machine groaned as its colossal legs shifted, scanning the area for signs of life. But it hadn't accounted for Darius, not in this environment. Here, he was a predator, and this mechanical monstrosity was a prey. The exposed power junction, now within arm's reach, hummed with energy. Darius crouched behind a chunk of debris, quickly attaching the explosive to the thin plating that guarded the war machine's critical system. He set the timer for a few seconds, then retreated into the shadows, his heart pounding in time with the ticking countdown. A muffled thunk echoed through the air, followed by a brilliant flash of light. Sparks flew as the explosive detonated, sending a shockwave rippling through the machine systems. The war machine staggered, its shields flickering and fading as the power junction failed. Darius didn't wait. He sprang into action, racing across the rubble toward the machine's now exposed back. The beast swiveled, its massive guns roaring to life. Plasma bolts screamed through the air, searing the ground as Darius zigzagged, keeping his movements unpredictable. He knew one direct hit would incinerate him instantly, but fear was an old companion, and he'd long since learned to live alongside it. The machine lumbered forward, firing wildly, but Darius was already scaling its armored leg, gripping onto jagged metal and using his momentum to climb. The machine jerked violently, trying to shake him off, but Darius held fast, muscles burning as he pulled himself higher. This close, the heat from its core radiated through the armor, the whine of its servos deafening. He reached the central chassis, where the power core lay buried beneath layers of protective plating. His fingers scrambled for a purchase as the machine bucked beneath him, thrashing like a wounded animal. Darius felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it. One wrong move, and he'd be crushed. With a fierce growl, he found a weak spot in the armor, a seam just wide enough for his fingers to pry apart. He wrenched it open with raw, primal strength, ripping through the protective layer with gritted teeth. Sparks showered him, searing his skin, but he pushed past the pain. His only focus was the core. Inside, the war machine's power source pulsed with an eerie blue light, throbbing like a heartbeat. Darius knew what he had to do. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, he reached into the core chamber, feeling the intense heat radiating through his gloves. The machine jolted again, nearly throwing him off, but he held on, teeth clenched in determination. With a final brutal pull, Darius ripped the power core free. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The war machine groaned, its movements faltering as the energy drained from its systems. Its massive legs buckled, collapsing under the weight of its own armor. Darius leapt clear just as the machine toppled, crashing to the ground with a thunderous roar that echoed across the ruins. He hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact. His muscles screamed in protest, and his breath came in ragged gasps, but he forced himself to stand. He turned to face the fallen machine, its once gleaming frame now lifeless and still, smoke curling from the gaping wound where its core had been. In the distance, high above the battlefield, alien generals watched through their surveillance feeds. Their expressions, once smug with confidence, were now twisted in shock and disbelief. This war machine, this unstoppable juggernaut, had been brought down by a single human, armed with nothing but his will in his bare hands. Darius spat, wiping the blood from his cracked lips. He could feel their eyes on him, the alien commanders who had thought they were invincible. They had underestimated him, underestimated humanity, and now they were seeing the consequences of their arrogance. The wreckage around him was silent, the battlefield eerily still in the aftermath. Darius stood over the fallen war machine, his chest heaving with exhaustion. His entire body ached from the ordeal, his hands bloodied and burned, but he remained standing, defiant. He looked up at the sky, where he knew the alien fleet hovered, observing him like some insect beneath their boot. His gaze narrowed. They had sent their war machine to crush his kind, to wipe humanity from existence. But they had failed, and now they knew what they were up against. A Deathworlder. Darius turned away from the wreckage, the weight of his comrades' deaths heavy on his shoulders. He was the last of his battalion, but he wouldn't be the last human to fight. His battle wasn't over, not yet. Somewhere, deep inside, he felt a spark reignite. They hadn't won, not yet. The aliens would come again. They always did. But next time, they'd know better than to send a machine.